Welcome to History 374, Surveillance State, History of U.S. Domestic Spying. This is a timely course because never in U.S. history has their government more thoroughly monitored its citizens. The domestic spying is not new, we're living in a brave new world. The idea behind this course is to give you some historical background on the practice of Americans spying on other Americans. This has been done for many different reasons throughout U.S. history, as we will see over the next 6 weeks. Spying has changed with the historical context. With this lecture, I'd like to introduce you to the topic by working backwards. We're going to start with the present, taking a look at our own time. Over the next several weeks, we'll see how we got to this point. We're starting our story at the end, and then jumping back in time to the colonial era. And then we'll work our way back closer to the present. So let's begin. Take a look at this nondescript warehouse. Looks like any old warehouse in the middle of nowhere. But what goes on inside there? Well, in fact, we're not sure. This is the newest facility of the National Security Agency. It's known as the Utah Data Center. This was completed in 2014 at a cost of over $1.5 billion. The NSA was created back in 1952 at the height of the Cold War, when there was a concern about communist spies from the Soviet Union infiltrating the United States. Today, the NSA is primarily responsible for cybersecurity. And it gathers, collects reams and reams of data, exabytes of data. Much of it stored here at this center in Utah. So clearly the NSA has outgrown its old facility. Its headquarters is centered in Fort Meade, Maryland. The growing size of the NSA is indicative of the growing size of the surveillance state. The surveillance state is expanding in this current context. Today we're going to focus on why that is. Why is our time so different? What accounts for the expansion of the surveillance state? Before we get to that discussion, I want to start with something a little more basic right now. I'm looking at what does it mean to be a spy? What is a spy? What is spying? If you were to look up the basic definition in a dictionary, as I have, you would see these definitions, the ones produced here on the slide. As you see, it gives 3 different definitions. Let's take a look at them. The first identifies a spy as a person employed by a government to obtain secret information or intelligence about another, usually hostile country, especially with reference to military or naval affairs. Second definition is a bit more general and generic. A person who keeps close and secret watch on the actions of another or others. So this could be anyone. This could be somebody taking a cell phone and snapping a picture of their neighbor. The third describes industrial espionage or corporate espionage. A person who seeks to obtain confidential information about the activities, plans, methods, etc. of an organization or person, especially one who is employed for this purpose by a competitor. So if Pepsi stole the formula for Coke, they would be engaging in that kind of espionage, stealing trade secrets. Now, when you think of a spy, think of the word spy, probably the most common association are government spies. Maybe some of you think of James Bond, perhaps the most famous spy in popular culture. Though, of course, most spies' lives are a little more mundane. They're collecting information, gathering data, and not drinking martinis and wearing tuxedos. So we're going to talk about government clandestine operations against other countries, but also, as is increasingly the case, the monitoring of Americans. As a second definition of a spy suggests, there is a more informal kind of spying, and that is neighbors watching neighbors, ordinary people keeping tabs on other ordinary people. This practice is famously captured in a popular movie from 1954, Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. It starred Jimmy Stewart, pictured there. He plays a photographer who breaks his leg, is laid up, confined to his apartment, and he spends his days staring out his rear window and keeping watch on his neighbors. Now, spying of all kinds raises ethical questions. Spies for governments and militaries are often reviled. If they're working for your government or your group, then they could be considered heroes. But if they're working for the other side, they are despised. In fact, as we will see when we talk about spies during the American Revolution, spies, once captured, were quickly executed. They were treated differently from prisoners of war. There is shame with being captured. But even informal spying, though maybe not life and death, does raise ethical questions about how proper it is to keep tabs on others. And the movie Rear Window captures this discussion. The discussion surrounding how proper it is to keep tabs on ordinary people around you is often referred to as rear window ethics. And a couple of characters from the movie capture the essence of this debate. The character Lieutenant Doyle says to Jimmy Stewart when he learns that he's spying on his neighbors, "That's a secret private world you're looking into out there. People do a lot of things in private they couldn't possibly explain in public." So what he's suggesting, accurately in fact, is that when you're monitoring those around you, you're only getting partial information. You're seeing bits of behavior, not a full picture. Something may make sense in private, but not make sense in public. To put it another way, the character of Stella says intelligence, nothing has caused the human race so much trouble as intelligence. Of course, this statement has a double meaning. Intelligence, on the one hand, means how smart a person is. So she's saying people are growing too smart for their own good. But there's another meaning of intelligence, that's information gathered. And so she's saying that gathering too much information about others can also be dangerous. It can lead to false conclusions. It can lead to paranoia. And those things can lead to dangerous behaviors and actions. And then there is corporate espionage. We're going to focus mainly on the first two kinds in this course, but all of these raise ethical issues that we will explore throughout the course. So let's return to that question I raised earlier. How come today the surveillance state has reached new heights? How come we are watched more closely than ever before? I want to suggest two reasons. You may have some others in mind. I'm going to focus on two. Perhaps those others will come up in your discussion. The first, suggest, is the ongoing war on terrorism. After the terror attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C., back in September 2001, the nation has been on a constant state of alert. American troops have been fighting in Afghanistan since October 2001. The war in Iraq began back in March 2003. And in addition to these ongoing fights, U.S. Special Forces and drones have been active in other parts of the world, including Libya and Syria, to name a couple. So generally speaking, during wartime, the surveillance state tends to expand because there are greater threats, there's greater fear. This is when, in wartime, when tensions are at their highest, when suspicion is rampant, and when fear, perhaps even paranoia, grows to new levels. So paranoia during wartime isn't necessarily new. These are propaganda posters from the world wars. And as you see, there was a great deal of concern about information falling into the wrong hands. One poster warning that spies are listening. Another says, beware of spies. And then the third says, loose lips might sink ships. The message here is keep your mouth shut, because somebody working for the enemy might overhear what you say, and that information could be passed on, suggesting that those who even inadvertently share information with enemies could be considered traitors. So additional surveillance during wartime is not new. But the nature of the war on terrorism has amped up fears and ushered in an unprecedented level of surveillance. In this current battle, the war on terrorism, civilians are targets. At the bottom of the slide there, you see the aftermath of an attack on Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, Turkey. That occurred recently. An airport was attacked, not a military installation, but a place where people go to get from point A to point B via airplane. The higher image on the slide captures the aftermath of a bombing in a popular shopping center in Baghdad, Iraq. The death toll from this attack, some 200 people. So attacks like this raise the question, who is the enemy? This has been the subject of heated discussions and fierce political debates. When attacks occur here in the United States, the debate becomes even more fierce. The San Bernardino attack of December 2015, for example. In that particular terrorist attack, a U.S. citizen and his wife, a lawful permanent resident, killed 14 and wounded 22. In addition to that, we've recently witnessed the worst mass shooting in U.S. history, when a man attacked the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, taking the lives of 49 people and wounding scores of others. These are just a couple of the more recent examples of terror attacks here in the United States. In a scenario in which it's unclear who poses a threat and when that threat may occur and where it may occur, you've seen the surveillance state to an unheard of level. So, in other words, this is a different kind of war from World War I or World War II. In World War II, your enemy is Hitler's Germany, and so you take France, you take back Belgium, you fight your way through Germany on your way to Berlin, you capture the capital, Germans surrender, war is over. This war on terrorism doesn't quite that way. It's not the militaries of different countries fighting each other on battlefields. And so that has had the effect of heightening tensions, increasing the scope and scale of the surveillance state. What's this that you all are so familiar with? If you see something, say something. Ordinary citizens are asked to be ever vigilant, to keep watch for the next suspicious character who might, say, turn something like the Boston Marathon into a tragedy, as happened a few years ago. So what made this surveillance state possible? It was a piece of legislation signed into law back in 2001. Here you see President George W. Bush signing the Patriot Act, surrounded by congressmen. Let's discuss what this act is all about. Since 2001, the act has been renewed several times and also amended, and we'll talk about those changes later on. So some details about the Patriot Act, which has opened the door to the massive expansion of the surveillance state that we're now experiencing. So it was signed into law by George W. Bush on October 26, 2001. So the fact that this came a little over a month after the attacks of September 11, 2001, shows that there is a direct connection between the war on terrorism and the expansion of the government's role in surveilling its citizens. What's the Patriot Act do? It gives the government sweeping powers to collect domestic data and monitor citizens. So it's not just keeping an eye on foreigners, people identified as enemies. It's keeping an eye on all of us. That is a result of Section 215, one of the most significant pieces of the Patriot Act, and also, as we will discuss soon, one of the more controversial pieces. Section 215 allows the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, to request, quote, any tangible thing related to a terrorism investigation. Those are the words from the Patriot Act. Any tangible thing. So, it could mean books, records of books checked out of the library or movies checked out of the library, bank records, phone records, emails, any tangible thing. Very broad category. More than half of the FBI's requests for access to any tangible thing related to a terrorism investigation have been requests made of Americans. So this is the surveillance state active toward Americans, keeping watch on Americans, including citizens. Now there is ostensibly a procedure to follow, a check in place to prevent abuse of this new ability conveyed by Section 215. There are in place what are called Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Courts, FISC or FISC. You may also see these referred to as FISA courts. Called that because they came into being back in 1978 with the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Think back to 1978. This was a time coming in the wake of the Vietnam War, in which the American public learned that the US government and military had been lying to the public about the causes of the Vietnam War, about the progress of the war, and about the hope for a successful conclusion. So there is a greater mistrust of government. Also, in the early 70s, President Richard Nixon resigned because of his role in the cover-up of his campaign operatives spying on the rival Democratic Party. So mistrust of the government was quite high. And so these courts were an attempt at an additional check within the system, greater transparency. So these courts, when originally created, are responsible for approving or denying law enforcement agencies' requests for warrants to monitor suspected foreign spies. Since the Patriot Act of 2001, these FISA courts have also been responsible for evaluating requests for warrants on suspected terrorists. So before the FBI has access to quote, any tangible thing, they have to get clearance from these FISA courts. Now, as this chart shows, these courts have sort of served as a rubber stamp, pretty much approving almost all requests. So there are not many barriers between federal law enforcement agencies and the information they want. These courts are not getting in their way. Nevertheless, it was revealed back in 2004, thanks to the release of internal FBI memos, that the Bureau was bypassing the courts.
You'll need to unlock your iPhone first.
The Bureau was bypassing the courts and monitoring citizens without warrants. Even though the courts were pretty much approving almost every request, the FBI was still working around the courts and circumventing even these minimal checks. More recently, we learned that the NSA had its own interpretation of Section 215, one that it did not reveal to the public. The NSA interpreted Section 15 to allow for bulk collection of U.S. citizens' electronic data. So what this means is that they do a broad sweep. They contact Verizon, for example. The NSA contacts Verizon and says, we want records of all phone calls from this date to that date. All phone calls, whether they involved suspected terrorists or not. You ordered a pizza and you're a Verizon customer during that time span, your records are collected by the NSA. We learned this practice of bulk collection because a former NSA contractor by the name of Edward Snowden, pictured there on the slide, leaked classified documents to the press. Snowden is now in exile in Russia because if he returns to the United States, he will be tried. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, has called Snowden a traitor. So he would be in trouble if he returns to the U.S. This revelation of bulk collection of citizens' electronic data has caused quite a bit of an uproar. The Patriot Act, particularly Section 215, as I mentioned earlier, they've been controversial. These two posters suggest that there is significant opposition to these practices. There's former President George W. Bush with headphones, looking like Uncle Sam, saying, "I hear you," thanks to unwarranted wiretapping. Now, many supporters of Barack Obama believed, or at least hoped, that he would move away from the surveillance state that had been established in the previous administration. Well, their hopes were dashed as the practices have continued. And his poster is critical of the president. Yes, we scan. We are watching you, it says. Obey us. Control. And then at the bottom of the slide, you see a protest against the NSA's bulk collection. The argument that opponents are making is that we are not suspected of a crime. Why are you collecting our data? It's not just NSA, it's not just the FBI that is collecting such records. The Justice Department under Barack Obama has been monitoring the phone records of reporters, including some working for the Associated Press, including the records of Fox News reporter James Rosen. The Justice Department has done this because these reporters have had contacts with government employees who have leaked classified information. And in order to get access to those leakers, the government has been monitoring reporters and intimidating them, which has caused quite an uproar, particularly among journalists who say this violates freedom of the press and can have a chilling effect on the relationship of reporters to their sources and their ability to serve as a check on government excess. Another federal agency that has access to a vast trove of phone data is the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. In fact, the phone records that the DEA has access to is larger than the NSA's, all in the so-called war on drugs. It turns out, though, that these practices are not confined to the federal government. Their surveillance state is not just the federal government. State law enforcement, local law enforcement have also been getting in on the act. It's not just the NSA, the USA Today tells us. So if you look at that brief excerpt from this USA Today story, armed with new technologies, including mobile devices that tap into cell phone data in real time, dozens of local and state police agencies are capturing information about thousands of cell phone users at a time, whether they are targets of an investigation or not, according to public records. So this is similar to the NSA's bulk collection of data, of phone records. State and local law enforcement also have these capabilities. So it would be more accurate to say, I suppose, that there isn't just one surveillance state, but many surveillance states that we are all subject to. One example of this, and a recent one, is that the New York Police Department used to have what was called a demographics unit. And I say used to because it no longer exists. This demographics unit would dispatch plainclothes police officers to Muslim communities, eavesdrop on conversations, track them, follow them, see where they lived, worked, socialized, ate meals. One of the reasons why the demographics unit no longer exists is that the NYPD was the subject of 2 federal lawsuits on the basis of profiling based on religion. The NYPD settled those lawsuits out of court for an unspecified amount, and the demographics unit no longer exists. The NYPD deemed this unit necessary in the context of the war on terrorism. Of course, New York City has been a target in the past. And so in this heightened state of security, Muslims became a target. So the war on terrorism is changing the rules of surveillance. But as many of these examples we've discussed show, that there's another piece to this puzzle. It's not just the context of this unique war that we're witnessing, that we're a part of. It's also the new technology in our hands. Technology is changing the rules. Cell phones, smartphones, tablets, laptops, the internet, social media, all of these are wonderful tools for communication, for creating information, for sharing information. They connect us with one another, connect us to people in far-flung parts of the world, give us access to information we never would have had access to before. But the rub in all of this is that the connections we're building, we're also building inadvertent connections. I would warn you that if you're applying for a new job, you might want to shut down your Facebook page if there's anything you don't want anyone else to see. And of course, is because of these new technologies that the NSA, for example, can collect our data in bulk. We are connected to the government in ways we may not be aware of at the time. And we are being monitored, we are being surveilled, we're being kept tabs on. That's not just new technology. Old technology is being used in new ways. Traffic cameras, street cameras, today, and of course cell phone cameras. Today, it is easier to see something and then say something than it's ever been. There's so much to see. There's so much imagery being captured by still and moving cameras. Street cameras are all around. Some put up by towns and cities, others by store owners, banks, and other businesses. A camera may record you running a red light, and you'll receive a ticket soon after. A camera will capture you at the ATM. These cameras capture countless hours of ho-hum ordinariness. People going about their days, going shopping, walking down the street on their way to work, chatting with friends. But on occasion, these cameras will capture moments of horror, as was the case back in April 2013. This still image here is from a street camera in Boston from April 15th, 2013. And the young men in that image are Tamerlan, he's closer to in that image, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, brothers who were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. It was thanks to these cameras that they could be identified as suspects and then tracked down. Tamerlan died in a firefight with law enforcement. Dzhokhar was later captured, and he has been tried and sentenced to the death penalty in the state of Massachusetts. So we are being watched from street cameras, traffic cameras, in some cases, maybe even from the sky. The Pentagon, the US military, has acknowledged that it has used spy drones to monitor the United States. You probably most frequently hear about drones dropping bombs on terrorists in other parts of the world. But they've also been used for this purpose, to keep watch. Now, the Pentagon did an internal study, and they assert that these spy drones have been used in a very limited capacity here in the US, and that there's no evidence of any abuses, wrongdoing. But it's just another example of technology allowing for the expansion of the surveillance state and surveilling not just foreigners, not just enemies abroad, but keeping tabs on Americans here in the United States. So why does this all matter? After all, many states throughout history and currently closely monitor their citizens. In China, there are thousands of sensors monitoring exchanges on the internet, blog postings, for example, social media exchanges. And they're not just looking for criminals, they're also looking for dissenters, people to punish for challenging their government. So this kind of monitoring isn't unique to the United States. So why is it worthy of discussion? Why is it controversial? Why is it worthy of a summer course? Well, because of America's unique history. As you all know, the United States was founded when colonists of Great Britain rebelled, fought a war for independence back in the late 1700s. And they fought that war to free themselves from an overbearing monarchy in Great Britain. Limited monarchy, but a monarchy nonetheless. And coming out of that revolution, as they were establishing a new nation, they established a nation with a limited government, as spelled out in the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788. In a shift away from what they deemed tyrannical rule on the part of King George III and British Parliament, they created an American system that has checks and balances built in through the separation of powers. I'm sure you've learned this in grade school and high school. There are three branches of the federal government. There's the executive, that's the president. There's the legislative branch, made up of Congress, Senate, and House of Representatives. And there's the judiciary branch, the court system. And the idea behind these three branches is that with all of them in place, they can act as a check on each other. The president can't grow too powerful because there's a Congress and a court system in place to prevent that from happening. There are checks on government authority. In fact, since ratification, more checks have been added. To give one example, in 1951, the Constitution was amended to limit the president to 2 terms. So you can't have a president run 8 times and hold power for that long. So one of the founding principles of this nation is that government should be relatively small, should be limited. As we see, though, in the war on terrorism, and with new technologies available, the power of the government is growing. Its ability to surveil its citizens is growing. Even more important for our purposes in this course is the portion of the Constitution called the Bill of Rights, which was added after the ratification of the Constitution proper, ratified in 1791. The Bill of Rights describes the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The idea behind this Bill of Rights is that there were many who objected to the Constitution, even with checks and balances in place, even with no monarchy and a limited government. There were some who objected to the Constitution, said that it created a government that was too powerful, and that it would run roughshod over the rights of citizens and the rights of states. So the goal of the Bill of Rights was to appease those people who objected to the Constitution, say, come aboard the Constitution and we'll change it. We'll improve it. Improve them in such a way that it will strengthen the rights of individuals and the rights of states. So I want to highlight a couple of these amendments because they are quite relevant to this course. Let's start naturally with the First Amendment, which, as you see, is quite wide-ranging. It protects 5 fundamental freedoms. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now that's a mouthful. To sum it up simply, though, First Amendment protects freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, meaning gathering in public to protest, and to petition the government, to lobby the government, to encourage it to change. So this is relevant to the topic at hand, for a number of reasons. First of all, the First Amendment suggests that Americans may freely practice their religion without being targeted. That was the problem that the NYPD Demographics Unit ran into when it was singling out Muslims for special attention, special scrutiny. And the NYPD was sued as a result and settled those lawsuits out of court. First Amendment also suggests that Americans are free to criticize, protest against, and petition their government without fear of reprisals. So you could say, this is the worst Congress ever. You could say, the president's doing a terrible job. You could say, we've got to start over with the court systems, remove all the justices. And you shouldn't be considered a traitor, a dissident. You should be free to speak your mind in theory. First Amendment also protects a free press. The motive behind protection for the free press, behind this is the belief that the press is crucial to a sovereign people. What I mean by a sovereign people, that means that power is supposed to be invested in all American citizens, not the president, because we pick the president, right? Not in Congress, because we pick Congress, and they appoint justices and judges. The press is supposed to be the voice of the people. It keeps tabs on the government. It serves as a watchdog, an additional check on the government. A free press, not affiliated with the government, can report on corruption, the wrongdoing of people in office, their misdeeds, report them to the people, and an informed public will make informed decisions. Vote out the bums, vote in a fresh batch of leaders. So when the Justice Department monitors and intimidates the press, that could have a chilling effect, threatening reporters, preventing them from doing this important work of serving as that additional check on the government. Even more important for this course is the Fourth Amendment. Amendment 4 goes like this: the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This means that if law enforcement wants to search your home, they have to identify evidence supporting probable cause. We suspect there are illegal narcotics in your house. The neighbors reported a bad smell and there's a missing person in the area. Whatever, there has to be proof or evidence of some connection between you and a crime before they can justify searching your person, your private papers, your possessions, your home. It has to be justified. Americans should not be subject to search and seizure unless there is probable cause of wrongdoing. So maybe you've already made this connection, but this is why many have objected to the NSA collecting phone records in bulk, because they're not distinguishing the records of suspected criminals, suspected terrorists, and those who are under no suspicion. In those masses of records that are being collected, there potentially are conversations between those who want to do Americans harm, but there's also conversations between mothers and sons, between people and neighbors, people ordering Chinese takeout. All of these things are being swept up in this dragnet that the NSA has created. So the question is, how does that jive with the Fourth Amendment? Or does it? The Fourth Amendment serves as the basis, in part, for the idea that we as Americans have a right to privacy. To be clear, the word privacy does not appear in the Constitution. There is no explicit right to privacy. But there is a legal tradition called the right to privacy. And you're going to read a piece written by the men pictured there. Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, who wrote a piece on the subject of a right to privacy, and they point to the Fourth Amendment, which they say suggests at least we have a right to be left alone. The government should not be harassing us and bothering us unless there is a specific reason for it. So you'll read more about that and discuss that on the discussion board later in the week. To be sure, even though these rights may seem pretty clear, they're there in black and white in the Constitution, they are unsettled. They were contested right from the start. I'll give you one example. In 1798, President John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law. There's John Adams pictured there in the corner. John Adams, one of the founders. George Washington's vice president, the second president of the United States, signs into law the Alien and Sedition Acts. I'm going to focus on the Sedition Acts, the sedition part of this, and what that allowed for. And a person, a U.S. citizen, can be fined and put in prison if they, quote, write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. To sum that up and put it simply, the Sedition Acts criminalized any criticism of the government, made it a crime to add things about John Adams, to be critical of the functioning of government. How does that jibe with the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech? On the face, it doesn't seem to, but nevertheless, it became law. Now, these acts expired in 1801, so they're no longer in effect. But since then, there have been similar kinds of laws passed, some of which are still on the books. We will discuss those later in the course. So if the First Amendment can be challenged in this way, today it seems that the Fourth Amendment is being challenged in profound ways as well. So there is a struggle. There is a struggle taking place over the meaning of American principles, and of course a very real struggle in which people are dying at marathons or dying in war zones. But this surveillance can be a two-way street. The government can keep keeping tabs on your emails and your phone records. It's also possible in some cases for citizens to turn the tables, turn the technology in their hands on those in authority and those who may be abusing that authority. Much in the news lately is the deteriorating relationship between African American communities and police departments. One of the reasons for that is because of the omnipresence of cell phones. This still image here is part of a video that was captured by a bystander. He captured a police officer in South Carolina, pictured to the right of the screen, shooting the man running away, Freddie Gray, shooting him 8 times in the back. The story that the police officer gave to superiors did not match what we've seen in this video. So it's possible to challenge those in power with these technologies. And this can be a two-way street. In addition, if the NSA is able to collect data in bulk, then that same data can also be dumped, can also be shared in massive quantities. And this has happened on occasion. Chelsea Manning, formerly known as Bradley Manning, was a soldier who leaked classified documents to a website called WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is a website founded by Julian Assange, an Australian man, pictured there at the bottom of the screen. And this website and Assange have dedicated themselves to exposing these secrets that governments try to keep. And Chelsea Manning provided secret information to WikiLeaks. Chelsea Manning, for doing that, has been sentenced to 35 years in prison. And we discussed earlier Edward Snowden, former NSA contractor who had access to thousands of NSA records that he shared with the press in bulk. They were collected in bulk and they were shared in bulk with the public. And we've learned a great deal from what Snowden released. Now, some of you may have strong opinions about Snowden. As I said earlier, some call him a traitor, some think he's a hero. Regardless of your personal feelings about him, the information he released did certainly teach us something we didn't know before. And that information has spurred change. The headline at the top of the screen, as you see, it's from May 2015. After the revelations from the leaks from Edward Snowden, there were challenges to the NSA's bulk collection practices, challenges in the court. And an appeals court, which is the level right below the Supreme Court, ruled that the NSA's practice of bulk collection is illegal, violates the Constitution. Take a look at the bottom of the screen at that next headline. The following month, what happens? The Senate approves USA Freedom Act. Obama signs it after amendments fail. What is the USA Freedom Act? This act revised, changed the Patriot Act, eliminating explicitly the NSA's ability to collect phone data in bulk. Doesn't mean it's not necessarily happening, but at least it's in writing that this is not an acceptable practice. So we're living through a period of tremendous change. The surveillance state has reached new heights. But these recent developments show that there can be the possibility of dialing the surveillance state back. The direction that the surveillance state goes in is in part up to us if we do practice the sovereignty that's supposed to be invested in us by the Constitution. But where we go from here in this course is actually back in time. We're going to look at past practices of domestic surveillance, starting with the colonial era, which fell mainly into the category of more informal spying, but there was an official element as well. So that's where we'll go next. Before we get there, you will take a quiz based on this lecture. You will participate in a discussion and post at least twice to the discussion board before the end of the week, before we move on to next week's topic.